My name is Harold Mason, and I am 81 years old. I live alone in a small beige house on the outskirts of Fairfield, Iowa. Most people here know me, or used to. I was the high school's music teacher for nearly 40 years. Every spring concert, every graduation, every national anthem at the football field bore my hands at the piano or the baton in my trembling grasp. That tremble, it didn't used to be there. Back in my prime, my fingers were precise, my pitch absolute, and my voice, well, I used to sing solos at church. Those who heard me back then still sometimes mention it, though less and less frequently now. It's been years since anyone asked me to sing, and the tremor, the one that's made me a stranger to my own body, is now the first thing people notice. Not my kindness, not my experience, not even my name, just the shake. The doctors call it essential tremor, which feels like a cruel name, as if implying that this betrayal of my hands and my voice is somehow necessary, built into the fabric of my existence. It started after my wife, Elaine, passed away 10 years ago, quietly in her sleep after a brief, ruthless illness that gave us little time to prepare, and even less to understand. She was the softener of the edges in my life, the one who made my routines feel like rituals rather than lonely repetitions. I used to say she could calm a thunderstorm with her presence alone. After she was gone, the silence in the house changed tone. It stopped being peaceful and became heavy. That was when the tremors began. Subtly at first, a teacup rattling in the saucer, a missed key in a familiar tune, and then gradually, persistently worse. Now my mornings start the same way. I wake before the sun, because age robs you of the luxury of long sleep. I shuffle to the kitchen in slippers that barely hold on to my feet. I make oatmeal because it's safe and requires little coordination. The kettle shakes in my hand, and sometimes I spill. I eat in silence, sitting in a dining room that still holds a place setting for Elaine. I haven't had the heart to remove it. After breakfast, I sit by the window. I like the way the light filters through the lace curtains she embroidered decades ago. I don't play piano much anymore. Not because I don't want to, but because it's painful to hear myself struggle with pieces I used to play effortlessly. Sometimes I try, and then I weep afterward, quietly, so no one can hear. I don't get many visitors. My son lives in Minneapolis with his wife and their 3 children, but he only calls on holidays. He says he's busy, and I don't doubt it, but it stings all the same. The people who used to be part of my daily rhythm, neighbors, fellow teachers, even old students, have mostly moved away or passed on. The world has grown younger around me, and it moves faster than I can follow. But there is one place that still ties me to something resembling a community, one ritual that still lends my weeks a shape: the Sunday service at St. Jude's Lutheran Church. Every Sunday, I iron my one good shirt and tie, both a little worn but still presentable, and make my way to church. I walk, slowly, using a cane now, passing houses that once held familiar faces and now are filled with strangers. The church is not far, a 15-minute walk that now takes me 30. I arrive early out of habit and sit in the third pew from the back. I used to sit closer to the front when Elaine was alive. She liked to be near the choir, and I like being near her, but now I sit back, partly to avoid the stairs, partly because I don't want anyone to see me struggling to stand during hymns. St. Jude's has changed in the last decade. The congregation is younger, livelier, louder. The music is no longer the gentle organ and piano duets of my time, but more upbeat. Guitars, drums, projection screens with lyrics. The new parish administrator, Kyle, is a young man with sharp suits and a sharper tongue. He came in 3 years ago, full of plans to modernize the message and engage new demographics. That's fine. Churches need to evolve, But I could tell from the beginning he didn't know what to do with people like me, the old, slow, and inconvenient. I've seen it in his eyes. The polite smile that fades too quickly, the way he avoids conversations with anyone who doesn't have a stroller or a smartphone. The pastor, Reverend Elijah Booth, is different. He's in his late 50s, with a calm demeanor and a voice that carries compassion in its tone. He often comes to check on me after service, placing a hand gently on my shoulder and asking, "How are you doing this week, Harold?" I appreciate it, though I rarely answer truthfully. "Fine, Reverend," I say, even when I'm not. "You learn to lie politely in old age. People prefer that. I used to play organ at the church. Every fourth Sunday, they'd let me do the prelude and sometimes accompany the choir. But last year, Kyle quietly suggested that the transitions were becoming a little rough and that maybe it's time to pass the baton to the next generation. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. My tremor made them uncomfortable. I didn't argue. I stepped back. They gave me a plaque a month later, thanking me for a lifetime of faithful service. It sits on my mantel next to Elaine's photograph. I haven't dusted it in weeks. Still, I attend. Not for them, but for me. Because in the silence after the sermon, in the shared prayers, I feel closest to Elaine. She loved the church. She was never political, never pushy, but she believed in kindness and in showing up. So I show up, even when my legs ache, even when the wind cuts through my coat like a blade, even when I suspect no one would notice if I stopped coming altogether. I come. But lately, I've started to feel more like an artifact than a person. The side glances, the impatient shuffling when I take too long to sit down. Last month, during the prayer requests portion, I raised my hand to ask for prayers for an old student who was hospitalized. My voice shook badly. A couple of people in the front pew turned their heads. Someone giggled. I saw Kyle exchange a look with a young woman, a smirk, fleeting but unmistakable. It felt like being stripped in front of everyone. I finished my sentence somehow, staring at the floor. No one mentioned it after. Not the pastor, not the people I used to sit with. It was as if I had spoken into a void. That night I sat at my desk, the one Elaine and I had bought in 1972 from a second-hand store in Cedar Rapids, and began to write. I hadn't written anything longer than a grocery list in years, but the words came. Slow and uncertain like my voice, but they came. I wrote about what it feels like to be dismissed because your body betrays you, about how community isn't just about the young or the lively or the photogenic, about what it's like to be seen as a problem when all you want is to belong. I didn't intend to send it, but I signed it, folded it, and addressed it to Reverend Booth. I thought, let him read it, and let that be the end of it. But it wasn't. The Sunday after I mailed the letter to Reverend Booth, I walked to church the same as always, but with a strange tightness in my chest. The morning was unusually cold for September, a damp Iowa chill that seeped through the layers of my coat and settled into my bones like a warning. I paused twice on the way, not from breathlessness, but hesitation. A part of me regretted sending that letter. I had sealed it with a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he would read it and understand. Not out loud, not publicly, just privately, the way an old friend might read a forgotten postcard. I hadn't expected him to respond. I certainly hadn't anticipated what was about to happen. When I arrived at St. Jude's, the parking lot was already half full. Families with strollers, teenagers with coffee cups, elderly couples moving slowly but deliberately toward the red brick entrance. I nodded politely at a few familiar faces, though none stopped to talk. I took my usual seat, third pew from the back, aisle side, and folded my hands in my lap to still their shaking. I watched the sanctuary fill, the sound of casual chatter and laughter bouncing against the stained glass windows. Up front, the praise band was tuning their instruments. The new organist, a young man named Travis with gelled hair and sneakers that squeaked, practiced a few chords, his fingers moving quickly, confidently, and without hesitation. I looked down at my hands. I kept them folded. The service began as usual. Announcements, 2 songs. The children were invited up for their blessing and sent off to Sunday school. Then came the pastoral message, the part where Reverend Booth usually gave a gentle, steady sermon about forgiveness or service or grace. But this time, something changed. He didn't walk to the center of the stage. Instead, he remained behind the pulpit, his notes closed in front of him, his hands resting calmly on either side. He looked out across the congregation with a stillness I recognized from his most serious moments, like funerals or hospital prayers. Then he said, "Before we begin today's sermon, I'd like to read something." There was a rustle of programs, a few confused glances. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. I recognized it instantly. My letter. My heart stopped. "I received this note earlier this week from one of our longtime members," he began. "They did not ask me to share it. In fact, I suspect they hoped I wouldn't. But I believe it contains something we all need to hear." I felt the air go out of my lungs. My eyes darted around the sanctuary. No one was looking at me yet, but I felt as if every breath was drawing attention. My throat tightened. I wanted to get up and leave, but my legs felt useless beneath me, heavy as lead. I gripped the pew with both hands, knuckles pale. Then he started to read. The words I had written, raw, unfiltered, private, filled the room in his steady voice. There are days I wake up and wonder if I've already died and simply forgotten to stop moving. That's how invisible I've become. I come here every Sunday, not out of habit, but out of hope. Hope that someone might see me, say my name, ask how I'm doing, and really mean it. But lately, it feels like I'm a ghost among the living, an echo in a house that's already been emptied. There were gasps, a shuffle of bodies, a whisper of discomfort that rolled through the pews like a wave. I sat frozen. His voice didn't waver. I know I'm old. I know my voice trembles and my hands shake. I know I take longer to speak, to stand, to sit. But I was not always this way. Once I sang in this sanctuary. Once I taught your children how to play the piano. Once I held the hand of my wife in the front row and wept at the beauty of a hymn. Now I am a cautionary tale. I am what you avoid becoming. I saw a woman in front of me put her hand to her mouth. Another reached for a tissue. A young man turned to look toward the back of the church, scanning faces. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath shallow, but I couldn't move. There is a cruelty in silence, in smiles, that vanish the moment I pass. In being talked over, stepped around, dismissed. I did not expect to be cherished in my old age, but I had hoped to be respected, to be remembered as more than a shaky voice and a slow gait, to be part of this community still. Reverend Booth's voice softened, and he paused. The sanctuary was utterly still. No one shifted, no one coughed. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for recognition, for dignity, for a place in the room that I helped build. I am not asking to be young again. I am asking not to be erased. He finished reading and folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the pulpit. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating. Then he said, "That letter was written by someone many of you know, someone who has been part of this congregation longer than most of us have been alive. I won't say his name unless he wishes to come forward. But I will say this. We have failed him. and we are failing others like him. My mouth was dry. My heart pounded like a drum in my ears. I wanted to vanish, to slip through the cracks in the old wooden pew and disappear into the foundation. But something strange happened next. Reverend Booth stepped down from the pulpit and walked to the center of the stage. "Let me ask you something," he said, addressing the room. "When was the last time you spoke to someone who sits alone every week? When was the last time you slowed down long enough to really look at someone, not through the lens of youth or usefulness, but through the lens of grace?" The letter you just heard is not unique. There are more heralds among us than we realize. He paused again. "If the author of this letter is here today, I want to thank you. Your honesty is a gift. You have held up a mirror to this congregation, and it is not a flattering reflection, but it is a necessary one." Then, without warning, his eyes met mine. I don't know if he recognized the expression on my face, or if he had known all along, but he nodded, slowly, deliberately, and then every head in the sanctuary turned. The spotlight that I had avoided for years, the gaze I feared most, it fell squarely on me. People stared, some with recognition, some with shame, some with open mouths. I didn't move, couldn't. My skin burned with embarrassment, but then I saw something unexpected. The woman in front of me turned fully around and reached for my hand. She was crying. A man 2 pews up, one of the very ones who had smirked at my faltering prayer weeks before, bowed his head and wouldn't look me in the eye. Someone across the aisle, a teenager, maybe 16, mouthed, "Thank you." And in that moment, something shifted. Not in them, in me. The shame I had carried so long, the feeling of being useless, embarrassing, outdated, it cracked. Just slightly, enough to let in the tiniest beam of something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity. I didn't speak. I didn't stand. I simply sat there, among people who had finally heard me, and wept. Not from humiliation, but from the strange, painful relief of being seen. The rest of the service blurred. I don't remember the sermon, the hymns, the benediction. I only remember Reverend Booth walking past my pew afterward and pressing something into my palm. It was my letter, folded neatly. "You did good," he said softly. I didn't answer. I just nodded, gripping the paper like a lifeline. When I walked home that day, I walked a little straighter. The tremor was still there, the wind still cold, and the distance still long. But something had changed. For the first time in years, I felt that my presence mattered, and yet I also knew this was only the beginning. Not everyone in that room had been moved. Not everyone appreciated what Reverend Booth had done. And soon, their disapproval would come knocking. Not on his door, on mine. In the days that followed, the church felt colder in ways I couldn't quite explain. The Sunday service after Reverend Booth read my letter out loud was subdued, as if the congregation was recovering from a collective embarrassment. Some people avoided eye contact with me altogether, as if my presence now carried a charge too volatile to engage. Others offered small tentative gestures of kindness, a soft pat on the shoulder, a murmured, "Bless you," a lingering glance. But I knew the difference between compassion and discomfort, and most of what I received was the latter. At coffee hour, which I normally skipped, I forced myself to stay. I wanted to see, not just how people would act, but how I would respond. I took a cup of weak coffee and stood near the corner table where Elaine used to sit with her friends. The chairs were now occupied by younger couples, mothers rocking babies, husbands checking phones. I stood quietly and sipped, pretending to be part of the room. "Mr. Mason," someone said. I turned to see a teenage girl from the youth choir, Marissa, approaching. She had braces and a journal clutched to her chest. I just wanted to say, "Your letter really moved me. My grandpa is like you. He doesn't say much, but I think he feels invisible too. I'm going to start calling him more. I think he misses us." I smiled and thanked her, genuinely touched. But as she walked away, I saw Kyle watching from across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just turned back to his conversation with a man in a slick wool coat and whispered something that made both of them laugh. It began subtly after that. The week after my letter, my name was absent from the bulletin. For over a decade, I'd been listed under prayer needs, longtime members, a quiet acknowledgement of age and frailty. But now, nothing. My name had vanished. I asked Mary, who prepared the bulletin, if there had been a mistake. She gave me a brittle smile and said, "Kyle said the list needed updating." Then came the change in seating. My usual pew, third from the back, was reserved the following Sunday. A bright pink sign read, "Reserved for family with small children." No one had ever reserved pews before. I asked if I could sit nearby, but Kyle, who now handled all sanctuary logistics, smiled thinly and suggested, "Why not try the back row? It's easier to get in and out, right?" I nodded and obeyed. I was not looking for a fight, but a part of me wilted inside. Reverend Booth remained kind, always taking a moment to greet me, to mention a line from my letter that had stayed with him, but he looked tired. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged when he walked, in the pauses between his words during sermons. I knew that reading my letter had cost him. He had stood up for me, and now the blowback was coming. At the following board meeting, the kind that Elaine used to attend when she was on the Women's Council, there was talk, I was told, about reevaluating leadership direction. A rumor floated that some of the larger donors were unhappy with the direction the church was taking, calling it divisive and overly emotional. I wasn't present, of course. I heard it from Claire, an old friend of Elaine's, who still volunteered in the church library. "They're not naming names," she whispered one day after service. "But it's clear they mean you. That letter, it stirred something. Not everyone liked it." And then the whispers began. It started with an envelope in my mailbox, unsigned. Inside was a church bulletin with a line circled in red ink. "Fellowship means unity in spirit, not division in speech." No note, just that. Then came the comments in passing. "Some things are better kept private. Not everything needs to be aired out like laundry. It's hard enough keeping young people engaged without guilt trips from the past." These weren't direct accusations. No one had the courage to confront me plainly. But I knew. I could feel it in the air, in the way conversations hushed when I entered a room, in the way Kyle's smile never reached his eyes. The most humiliating moment came 2 weeks later during a community luncheon. I had brought a small dish, Elaine's tuna casserole, the one she used to make for every potluck. I had followed her recipe exactly, even bought the brand of breadcrumbs she preferred, the kind with a little garlic in them. I placed it on the table with the others, next to casseroles and salads and Jell-O molds. No one touched it. Not a single serving was taken. I watched as people skirted around it, as if it were marked with a warning sign. I told myself it was coincidence, that people were full, that there were too many options. But I knew. I saw Kyle whisper something to a group of younger women as they passed my dish, and I heard one of them say, "Oh, I don't want to get food poisoning." That night, I went home and cried. Not the silent, contained tears of polite sorrow, but full, guttural sobs that I hadn't allowed myself since Elaine's funeral. I felt like a child, an old man weeping in his kitchen, a rejected soul trying to offer something warm and being met with contempt. I threw the untouched casserole into the trash and sat on the floor until the lights from the street dimmed through my windows. I began to question myself. Had I overstepped? Had I embarrassed the church, the community, myself? I reread my letter a dozen times. It didn't seem angry. It seemed honest. Painfully honest, yes, but not cruel. I hadn't named names, hadn't pointed fingers. I had simply told the truth, or at least my truth. But truth, I was beginning to learn, is only welcome when it doesn't shake the foundation. Then came the confrontation with Kyle. One afternoon, I stopped by the church office to drop off a donation envelope. I still gave, even if part of me questioned why. As I was leaving, Kyle stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Mason," he said too cheerfully. "A moment." I turned. He gestured toward his office. I followed slowly. He closed the door behind me and motioned to a chair. I remained standing. "I just wanted to touch base," he began, folding his hands over his desk. "There's been a lot of conversation lately. Some of the members feel your letter, and the attention it's drawn, has created discomfort." "I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable," I replied quietly. "I'm sure you didn't," he said, voice syrupy. "But discomfort isn't always bad, right? Sometimes it pushes us to grow. That said, we're trying to create a more inclusive environment here, one that focuses on moving forward." I frowned. "And what does that mean exactly?" He smiled. "It means we want everyone to feel welcome, even those who feel that maybe their time of leadership has passed." It was a veiled warning. I knew it. He wanted me silent, invisible, out of the way. "I'm not trying to lead anything," I said. "I'm just trying to belong." He nodded, as if indulging a child. "Of course. And we value you, Mr. Mason, deeply. But maybe now's the time to let the next generation steer the ship." I left without responding. That night I wrote a second letter. Not to Reverend Booth, but to myself. A kind of journal entry. I wrote, "They want silence. They fear the sound of age. They fear the reminder of where they're headed. But I am not afraid. I've walked through grief. I've lived through loss. My voice may tremble, but it still speaks. I will not apologize for existing." I folded it and placed it in my desk, next to Elaine's letters. The church was changing, and not for the better. The cracks were showing, and as much as they wanted me to fade quietly into the background, I knew now that I wouldn't, because something had started, and I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. The turning point came on a Sunday morning that began like any other. Gray skies, wind whispering through the sycamores outside my window. The usual ache in my joints as I reached for the buttons on my shirt. I had nearly decided not to go. I sat on the edge of my bed, already dressed, tie-knotted and shoes polished, and just stared at the floor for what must have been 20 minutes. The weight of it all, the whispers, the quiet exile, the empty casserole dish in the trash. It sat on my chest like stone. I thought of staying home, of listening to the service on the radio like some of the other older members did, but I couldn't. Not because I felt obligated. I needed to see with my own eyes what was becoming of the place that used to feel like sanctuary. I walked to the church slowly, more slowly than usual. My knees ached, and the sidewalk felt endless. When I reached the doors, something already felt different. There was a new banner above the entrance, bright and colorful, with the phrase, "A new season, a new spirit." Inside, the sanctuary had been rearranged. Gone were the pews at the back. Folding chairs had replaced them. A projector screen now hung from the rafters, and soft pop music was playing over the speakers as people took their seats. No organ music, No bulletin, no reverent silence. I found a seat on the far left in one of the remaining original pews and sat down without being greeted. The families that used to nod at me looked right through me now. Even the older members, the few who remained, seemed wary, as if afraid of being associated with the controversy. I knew I had become a symbol, and symbols make people uncomfortable. The service began with what Kyle now called a moment of joyful welcome. He bounded onto the stage with a microphone, dressed not in his usual blazer, but in jeans and a t-shirt bearing the church's logo. He spoke of growth, of vibrancy, of creating space for new voices and visions. "We are entering a new era," he said, "and while we honor the past, we cannot be shackled by it." There were cheers from the younger crowd, even some clapping. My stomach turned. When Reverend Booth finally took the pulpit, he looked different. Not physically, but in demeanor, tired, weighed down, as if he had fought one battle too many. He did not make eye contact with me. He read his sermon stiffly, sticking to the text, offering little of his usual warmth or reflection. When it ended, there was no invitation for prayer requests, no space for silence, just another upbeat song and a reminder from Kyle that coffee and refreshments would be served in the newly renovated fellowship hall. I remained in my seat as others filed out. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Perhaps for someone to notice me, to ask if I was all right. No one did. But then something unexpected happened. A boy, no older than 9 or 10, approached. He wore a clip-on tie and had freckles scattered across his nose like raindrops on glass. He held a folded piece of paper in both hands and extended it toward me without a word. I took it, confused. "Mom said I could give it to you if I wanted," he mumbled before hurrying away. I unfolded the note. It was handwritten in pencil, blocky and uneven. "Thank you for your letter. I'm scared to talk in class because my voice sounds weird. I felt better after you talked. I think your voice sounds strong. I hope you come back next week." There was no name, no signature, just a child's truth on a crumpled sheet of notebook paper. I sat frozen, the note trembling in my fingers. The sanctuary was empty now, but I stayed seated, staring at those words. Strong. He thought my voice sounded strong. My voice, which I had come to see as broken, shameful, an embarrassment. To someone else, it had been a source of courage. It was a strange, raw realization. All this time, I had measured the impact of my presence by how the adults responded, by their approval, their glances, their silence. I had forgotten that children listen too, that sometimes it's not the loudest or the most polished voices that echo the longest, but the ones that dare to speak through trembling. That note changed everything. I went home and placed it beside Elaine's photograph on the mantel. I read it 3 times that evening, and then I sat at the piano. It had been months since I last touched it. Dust had settled across the keys. I lifted the lid and ran my fingers, shaking, slow, along the ivory. I opened a hymnal, found an old favorite, and began to play. Not well, not cleanly. Notes stumbled, hands missed. But I kept going. I played the full song, and when it ended, I wept. Not from sorrow, but from something else entirely, a sense of return. The next morning I called Reverend Booth and asked if we could meet. He sounded hesitant, but agreed. We met in his office that afternoon. He looked older than I remembered. The lines around his eyes deeper, the light in his expression dimmed. "Reverend," I said as I sat down, "I don't want to cause trouble." He sighed. "You haven't caused trouble, Harold. You've held up a mirror. That's always painful." "I want to help," I said. "Not to lecture, not to divide. but I want to play. Just once. One hymn. He looked at me, surprised. You want to play? I won't ask again, I said. One song. No spotlight, no announcement, just music. He hesitated, then slowly nodded. Next Sunday, before the service. Prelude. That week, I practiced every day. I played slowly, deliberately, relearning the contours of a hymn I had once known by heart. I didn't aim for perfection. I aimed for presence. The piano became my prayer again. And on Sunday, I walked to church with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not certainty, but courage. The Sunday following my prelude, when I quietly played that single hymn before the service began, the sanctuary felt different. It wasn't the same space, but something had shifted in me. Yet the church was not done testing that shift. And I could sense the storm gathering just beyond the open doors. Even as the morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, I had returned, filled with a fragile new hope. But the currents beneath the surface were pulling me toward shores I hadn't expected. I arrived earlier than usual, the hymn still echoing in my mind, its chords warming my old bones. I glanced at the empty piano bench for a moment and then made my way to my seat, which was no longer marked by a reserved sign or rumor, but merely empty, a small, silent concession. Reverend Booth caught my eye briefly and nodded, his expression grateful but weary. I nodded back, offering a small, quiet gesture of thanks for allowing me that small moment of belonging. Then I turned to face the congregation. There were some smiles, hesitant but genuine, from faces I hadn't seen so softly before, and yet the air held something else, something wary, contained. The service began. The pastor delivered a sermon about compassion and the rhythms of forgiveness, beautiful in its intention, but I sensed it was for me and for those who had withdrawn their kindness. And then came what I had known would come, though I had hoped it wouldn't. After the final hymn, amid the usual announcements, Kyle took the microphone and cleared his throat. He spoke of church staff restructuring and thanked everyone for their patience during this season of transition. He announced that the old organ would be retired permanently, its place taken by a digital keyboard and a rotating schedule for guest musicians, including youth bands, worship teams, and community groups. He didn't mention me, but I felt the implication keenly. My role as the custodian of memory, the elder whose hands once held that organ's keys with tenderness and history, was being officially replaced. I sat very still. My heart pounded, but my face was calm. It felt like a funeral for a life I hadn't known I was mourning. The loss of the instrument, yes, but more the loss of what it symbolized. Continuity, dignity, a space for trembling voices to sound with grace. I watched as Kyle smiled and stepped down, the congregation applauding from habit, not heart, and I held on to my breath until the applause faded. The shift continued after service during coffee and fellowship. The familiar corners had been rearranged. The youth group table had grown, adorned with bright posters and smoothie cups. The senior table, once in the back corner where Elaine always volunteered, had disappeared entirely. When I walked over with my usual cup of tea, a young volunteer looked at me with surprise and said, we're clearing that table for the art class." I said nothing and stepped aside, setting my cup on a nearby round table, unsure where else to go. The art class, I later learned, used that corner for acrylic painting sessions for children. Something about paint and brushes and young voices was apparently more valuable than my silent presence. That afternoon, I received a letter, not part of the church's mail, but slipped under the door by someone in plain white paper. No signature. Its words were harsh. "We appreciate your contributions, but this community is moving forward. We cannot afford to hold on to the past. Please consider stepping down from any unofficial roles you maintain. Your presence is no longer necessary. It ended with no blessing, no farewell, just that cold erasure. I folded it and tucked it into my coat pocket, feeling the weight of that message settle on my chest like a stone. I didn't cry, but my breath trembled. I reminded myself that I didn't seek leadership, only belonging. I had never asked for attention, only acceptance. But acceptance, I was learning, must be granted as a gift, and in the absence of it, one's presence becomes untenable. That week, I wrote again. Not to anyone else, just in my journal of sorts. I wrote, "They want silence, clean and tidy. They fear history. They fear fragility. They fear that to honor people like me would remind them of fragility they'd rather deny. I don't blame them exactly. I blame fear." I paused, reading the words and letting them land. I don't blame them exactly. I blame fear. It was not full forgiveness, barely recognition, but it began something inside me. Saturday night, I rehearsed again, a private prayer in the form of music. I played not the hymn from the week before, but something older, a piece by Mendelssohn, slow and soft and sad, yet carrying a strange promise in its melody. I played until the sound echoed off the walls, until my fingertips glowed, until tears came, not of sorrow, but of release. The next morning I walked to church, not because I thought they'd welcome me, but because I needed to be seen when I played. I entered the sanctuary as usual, but this time I did not sit. Instead, I continued straight to the front. I sat at the organ bench and waited. Kyle's praise band shoes squeaked as he looked up, startled. The music director stilled, blinking. The congregation murmured. Reverend Booth rose from the pulpit, startled, then alarmed. I lifted my hands and played a single chord. It resonated in the air. Not loud, not triumphant, but defiant. And then I began to play. The Mendelssohn poured out, not for applause, not for approval, just because my voice through my hands needed to sound. The tremor was there, of course it was, but the notes bent and shimmered around it, finding shape in imperfection. I played through the piece, feeling every creak of the bench, every pulse of the wood beneath my fingers, every breath of air that carried sound to the stained glass. When it ended, there was silence so deep I thought the building itself was holding its breath. Then I stood, slowly, and met the gaze of Kyle, who watched me with shock, twisting his face. Reverend Booth stood behind me, looking anguished and awed and broken, as if he had seen something both beautiful and dangerous. Then the youth pastor, trying to patch the moment, cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, Harold." Bleak words, but those two syllables, your name, a name I hadn't heard spoken from that pulpit in months, landed on me like grace. I walked out without waiting for coffee hour or applause or conversation. I didn't want to see the hesitation in their faces. Outside, the air felt cold, sharp, real. I walked home without turning back. In the days that followed, the tension tightened. The bulletin came with Kyle's smiling face prominently displayed on the front cover, heralding fresh energy. My name was nowhere to be found. My pew again became not just overlooked, but deliberately vacant. No seat, no acknowledgement, no note that I belonged. I attended one more service after my performance, but was greeted with silence from the volunteers, whispered conversations at the check-in desk, and eyes averted when I entered the fellowship hall. The casserole dish from weeks before seemed like a generous offering compared to this official exclusion. But something in me had shifted irreversibly. The note from that child, the quiet moment at the organ, the knowledge that my trembling hands could still echo with meaning, they had changed me in ways that discomfort and hostility could not erase. They wanted me to be silent. They wanted me to vanish. But I had already begun to speak through sound instead of words. And that presence, rooted in dignity, anchored in softness and truth, could not be dismissed quietly. I decided to stop attending services for a while. Not because I was broken, but because I needed space to understand what I was becoming. I could feel the church fracturing. Reverend Booth was under pressure. The administration was shifting. The worship practices were evolving, and my place, once secure, once accepted, once honored, was being consciously erased. I left not out of defeat, but to observe from a distance, to let my presence linger invisibly while I considered the price of belonging, and whether my voice, shaking, aged, unglamorous, could still matter. And so the community pushed back, tightened its coils around me. But I had already begun to slip through them, not with shame, but with conviction. And that, I realized, would change everything. 3 weeks passed without my presence in the pews of St. Jude's. I did not wake early on Sundays. I did not press my slacks or polish my shoes. I did not iron my shirt or rehearse hymns in the silence of my home. I let Sunday come and go like any other day, and the house remained still, untouched by the quiet rituals that once gave it rhythm. And yet, despite my absence, the echoes of that last morning at the organ lingered. Not in the sanctuary, not among the congregation, but in letters, in voices on the phone, and in the face of one unexpected visitor who appeared on my doorstep just before the fourth Sunday. It was Reverend Booth. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though something in him had folded inward since our last conversation. He stood there in his long coat, holding a manila envelope in his hand, his breath curling in the cold spring air. I invited him in. We sat in the living room, the room Elaine once filled with flowers and light, now dim with the hush of old wallpaper and drawn curtains. He placed the envelope on the coffee table, but did not push it toward me. "I'm stepping down," he said after a long pause. "The board met with me last week. They asked for my resignation, said they needed new leadership to reflect the changing direction of the church. I said nothing at first. I only looked at him. This man who had read my letter, who had let my words rise over the congregation like a song, who had given me one last chance to sit at the organ and be part of something. And now he was paying for it. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "You deserve better." He shook his head. "It was coming. Your letter just sped it up." He paused, then added quietly, "You did nothing wrong, Harold. But they don't want discomfort. They want ease. And truth, even gentle truth, costs too much." He gestured to the envelope. "They're rewriting the church history pamphlet. Kyle's taken over the project. He's revising a lot. I thought you should see this." I opened the envelope. Inside was a draft, a slickly designed brochure titled Saint. Jude's, a new era of community. My name did not appear anywhere. Elaine's contributions to the women's choir, her years organizing charity drives, her name gone. The organ's installation, the decades of music, the youth music camps I had directed, the letters of thanks from students who went on to become musicians or teachers, not a word. It was as if we had never been there. I closed the envelope slowly and placed it on the table. "This is erasure," I said. He nodded. "Yes, I thought you should know." I looked at him, saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, and realized he wasn't just telling me. He was asking me something he didn't know how to say aloud. "They want me to disappear," I said. "But I'm not going to." "I didn't think you would," he said. He stood, shook my hand, and left. No prayer, no farewell sermon, no ceremony. Just a quiet departure into a world that had decided he no longer fit. That evening, I sat at my desk and pulled out the letter I had written to myself weeks earlier. The one that said, I will not apologize for existing. And I began to write again. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was a statement, a reckoning. I wrote the truth of my time at the church, not bitterly, not as an accusation, but as a witness. I named dates, names, events. I attached photos, programs, letters from former students. I typed it all neatly, printed it, and mailed copies to every member of the church board. I posted a version to the church's Facebook page. I sent it to the local newspaper's religion section. I didn't ask for anything. I simply told a story they were trying to erase. And then I waited. The fallout came swiftly. The Facebook post went viral. Not in a national sense, but locally. Dozens of former students, neighbors, fellow retirees commented, shared, and wrote their own stories. One woman remembered Elaine comforting her in the kitchen after her miscarriage. Another man, once a student of mine, wrote about how I helped him win a scholarship to college with piano lessons I gave him after school for free. A retired pastor from another town shared a letter Elaine had written him years ago, praising Booth's compassion during a funeral. People remembered. People remembered us. Kyle, of course, responded. His statement was polished, careful, and condescending. While we respect the contributions of former members, we also believe in moving toward a more inclusive future. He never addressed the erasure. He never acknowledged the names. He simply doubled down. But it was too late. 3 members of the board resigned within a week. 2 longtime donors publicly suspended their pledges. The music director stepped down, citing differences in vision. A group of young parents, moved by the online testimonies, began organizing a separate gathering in a community center, inviting Booth to speak and lead worship. And then one Sunday, I received an invitation, hand-delivered. It was from the youth choir director, a woman in her 30s I had barely spoken to, inviting me to perform at their spring concert. She wrote, "The children want to hear you play." Not the young version of you as you are now. Because what you did, showing up with shaking hands, it taught them something I never could. Please say yes. I said yes. The concert was held in the same sanctuary, the same walls, same windows, but it felt like another place. I was seated at the front, and when I approached the piano, the room fell silent. The children sat in neat rows, eyes wide, some holding sheet music, others just watching. I didn't say anything. I simply played, a simple song, one Elaine used to hum while baking. My hands shook. I missed a note, then another. But no one laughed. No one whispered. The notes found each other. They wove into melody. And when I finished, the children stood. Then the parents. Then everyone. They clapped not for perfection, but for presence, for truth. I stood, bowed slightly, and felt something close in me. Not pain, not grief. Something that had been open too long finally settled into stillness. The church, as it had been, would never return. But I had claimed my space. I had taken back my name, my voice, my history, and I had done it not with fury or vengeance, but with the same trembling hands that had once taught music and wrote letters and held a dying wife's hand in the dark. I had not been erased, and that, more than applause or restoration or even forgiveness, was enough. The days after the concert returned me to a quieter rhythm, but it was no longer the silence of dismissal or absence. It was the stillness of peace. Not every rift was mended, and not every face in that congregation turned warm, but it didn't matter. Something irreversible had happened inside me. I no longer waited for permission to belong. I had re-entered my life not as an accessory to the past, but as a witness to its worth. And that shift carried a strange, steadying power. I went about my days as before. Oatmeal in the morning, slow walks along the sidewalk, the same aching joints and quiet evenings. But the shame was gone, and in its place was a new dignity, one that didn't need applause to feel solid beneath my feet. The letters continued for a while. Former students wrote from out of state. A few elderly members who had stopped attending years ago reached out with cards that carried memories I hadn't heard in decades. I collected them in a shoebox, one of Elaine's old keepsake boxes she had labeled holiday ribbons, and kept it by my nightstand. I didn't read them all at once. I let them trickle through my weeks like steady rain on a rooftop, each one softening the loneliness that had taken root for too long. The boy who had written me that first note, the one with shaky pencil letters and no signature, later gave me a crayon drawing of a piano with the words, "Mr. Harold, don't stop playing." I taped it to my refrigerator. St. Jude's went on without me. Kyle remained for a time, but his grip loosened. The younger families who had once flocked to his language of innovation began to drift. Some sought quieter places of worship. Others followed Booth to the community center, where Sunday gatherings grew in number but stayed simple. I never joined them, not because I was unwelcome, but because I no longer needed to return to that space to feel whole. My belonging was no longer tied to a building or a bulletin. It lived now in the music I played, in the trembling voice I no longer hid, in the faces of those who saw me and did not look away. The organ at St. Jude's was never fully removed. It sat unused for months, tucked away behind the projection screens, like a relic too cumbersome to discard. I heard from someone that one afternoon, a member of the new tech team uncovered it and began to play, out of curiosity. The sound startled everyone. It wasn't perfect. The pipes had dust and the keys stuck, but it filled the sanctuary with something they hadn't heard in a long time. Something real. And just like that, they began using it again. Not every week. Not in place of the new instruments, but sometimes. Enough. I still play in my home, in the quiet, for myself. I play hymns Elaine loved and pieces that make me pause and close my eyes. I don't care about missed notes anymore. My hands shake, my fingers betray me. But I play anyway. Sometimes I imagine her voice humming beside me. Sometimes I speak to her aloud, telling her what happened, how I was nearly erased and how I spoke, how I stood, how I was seen. In the end, I was not restored to a pedestal. I was not handed back my old seat or my old title or the place they once gave me in the bulletin. But I gained something far more lasting. I kept my story. I kept my name. I did not vanish. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of growing old in a world that forgets so easily. You become your own archivist. You remember not to cling to the past, but to carry its truth forward, even when your voice shakes and your presence is inconvenient. You remember that kindness is not about nostalgia, and respect is not earned through youth or novelty, but through simply enduring, through choosing to be visible in a culture that prefers you small and silent. My name is Harold Mason. I am 81 years old, and I am still here. I still play. I still sing. My voice shakes, yes, but it speaks. And finally, someone listened.